The rain over Manhattan that evening was thin and cold, the kind that blurred the city lights into soft halos of gold and white. Outside the Ellsworth Grand, a seven-star hotel on the edge of Central Park, a line of black town cars stretched down the block, each one delivering another guest wrapped in silk and diamonds. Inside, chandeliers the size of small cars threw light across a ballroom filled with senators, media moguls, and the kind of old money that never needed to raise its voice to be heard. Tonight was the engagement dinner of Michael Whitfield, 34 years old, the youngest chief executive in the history of Whitfield Capital. Beside him stood his fiancée, Vanessa Cole, a woman whose beauty was often described as breathtaking and whose temper, though rarely seen by outsiders, was infamous among her staff. The evening had been planned for months. Every flower arrangement had been chosen twice. Every seating chart had been redrawn by hand until it satisfied Vanessa's sense of order, a hierarchy of importance she understood instinctively, the way some people understand music. Waiters moved between tables like dancers, balancing trays of champagne that cost more per bottle than most of America earned in a week. It was, by every visible measure, a perfect night, though none of them could have predicted how it would end. At exactly 7:40, a man walked through the front doors of the ballroom, and the room did not stop to notice him. Not yet. He wore a suit that had clearly seen many years of service, its fabric worn thin at the elbows, its cut a decade out of fashion. His shoes, though polished with obvious care, showed the soft creases of 100 long days. On his wrist sat a watch so plain and inexpensive that a teenager working a summer job could have afforded 3 of them. He carried no gift, no flowers, nothing but a folded card in his coat pocket, and a quiet, unreadable calm in his eyes. His name was Daniel Carter, and according to the small white envelope in his hand, he had been invited to sit at table 1, the table reserved for the most honored guests in the entire room. He found his seat without asking for help, pulled out the chair with the same unhurried patience he seemed to carry into every motion, and sat down among men in tailored tuxedos and women dripping in borrowed jewels that had never actually left their own vaults. A few heads turned. A woman in an emerald dress leaned toward her husband and whispered something behind a gloved hand. Somewhere near the bar, a young analyst from Whitfield Capital elbowed his colleague and nodded toward the man in the old suit, a silent question passing between them that neither could answer. Word moves quickly in a room built on appearances, and within minutes, the question had traveled from table to table like a current beneath still water. Who is he? By the time the appetizers were cleared, at least a dozen people had asked the question in one form or another, and not one of them had received a satisfying answer. Vanessa noticed him during the second course, while she was mid-laugh at something a senator's wife had said about a yacht in Monaco. Her eyes drifted past the senator's wife, past the flickering candles, and landed on the man at table 1, the table that sat closest to the head table, the table meant for family and the most important names in the Whitfield empire. For a moment, she assumed there had been some kind of seating error, the sort of mistake that happened when event planners rushed through logistics, and she made a small mental note to speak to her coordinator later. But the mistake, if it was a mistake, did not correct itself. And as the night wore on, something about the man's stillness began to needle at her. He did not check his phone. He did not glance around anxiously the way an uninvited guest might. He simply sat, occasionally sipping water, watching the room with the quiet attention of a man reading a book he had already finished once before. Finally, unable to let it rest any longer, Vanessa rose from her seat, smoothed the front of her gown, and crossed the room with the practiced grace of a woman who had never once doubted her right to walk into any space she chose. She stopped in front of Daniel's chair, close enough that the scent of her perfume reached him before her words did, and she looked down at him the way one might look at a stain on an expensive carpet. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the surrounding tables. "But I don't believe we've met. And I certainly don't remember inviting you." Daniel looked up at her, unbothered, and offered a small, polite nod. "I received an invitation," he said simply, reaching into his coat pocket and producing the folded card. "Table 1. Vanessa did not take the card. she barely glanced at it. Instead, she turned slightly toward the nearest cluster of guests, as though inviting them into the moment, and let out a short, sharp laugh that cut through the low hum of conversation like a blade through silk. "Table 1, she repeated, amused, is for family. For people who matter to this company. Not for whoever wandered in off the street." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the surrounding tables. Someone near the bar lifted a phone, angling it discreetly toward the unfolding scene, the small red recording light blinking to life. Daniel did not react to the laughter. He simply folded the card back into his pocket and looked at Vanessa with the same calm expression he had worn since he walked through the door. An expression that gave away nothing at all. "Do you even have the money for a meal like this?" Vanessa continued, her voice rising now, carrying easily across the ballroom. "This isn't a diner, sweetheart. You don't just walk in and sit wherever you like." More laughter followed, though it was thinner now, uncertain, the kind of laughter that comes from people who are not entirely sure whether they are witnessing comedy or cruelty. A few guests exchanged uneasy glances. Somewhere near the head table, Michael Whitfield had gone still, his champagne glass frozen halfway to his lips, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding across the room. Though he made no move to intervene, Vanessa pressed on, emboldened by the attention, the way certain people mistake silence for permission. "Did you think putting on a suit made you a businessman? Is that what this is? Some kind of costume?" The words landed hard, sharper than anything before them, and for a moment the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether the man in the old suit would finally crack, finally stammer some excuse or apology, and slink toward the door, the way she clearly expected him to. Instead, Daniel simply smiled. It was a small smile, almost gentle, the kind of expression a teacher might offer a student who had asked a question without realizing how much they still had to learn. "I was invited," he said again, quietly, "and I intend to stay for dinner." The silence that followed was different from the laughter before it, heavier, tinged with something like discomfort. Vanessa's cheeks flushed, not with embarrassment, but with irritation at being denied the reaction she had clearly been expecting. She turned toward the two security guards stationed near the ballroom entrance and lifted a hand, beckoning them over with the casual authority of someone accustomed to having her way. "Please escort this man out," she said, loud enough for the tables nearest to hear clearly. "He doesn't belong here." The guards exchanged a brief, uncertain glance before approaching the table, their footsteps slow, almost reluctant. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a graying mustache, leaned down toward Daniel and spoke in a low voice, an apology folded quietly beneath his professional tone. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with us." Daniel did not argue. He did not raise his voice or protest or reach for some hidden justification. He simply set down his water glass, folded his napkin with unhurried precision, and rose from his chair. As he stood, he reached up and adjusted his tie, an old, slightly faded piece of navy silk, straightening it with the same care a soldier might give to a uniform before stepping onto a parade ground. "Of course," he said. Then, turning slightly, his eyes swept once across the ballroom, across the hundreds of faces now watching him in various states of amusement, discomfort, and curiosity, before settling briefly on Vanessa herself. "Before I go," he said, his voice calm but carrying easily through the quiet room, "I only want to say one thing." Vanessa crossed her arms, lips curling into a satisfied smirk, clearly expecting some feeble attempt at dignity, some final grasping effort to save face before being led away in front of everyone she considered important. "I hope," Daniel said slowly, "that everyone in this room remembers exactly how they behaved tonight. Because some memories have a way of becoming very expensive." For a moment, nobody understood what he meant. The words hung in the air, strange and out of place. Too calm to be a threat, too pointed to be nothing at all. Vanessa laughed again, though it sounded thinner this time, less certain. "Is that supposed to scare me?" she asked, glancing around for support from the nearby tables. Daniel said nothing further. He simply allowed the two guards to guide him toward the side exit, his posture straight, his pace unhurried, as though he were leaving a restaurant after an unremarkable meal, rather than being publicly thrown out of the most important party of the season. But as he passed near the head table, something happened that no one in the room expected. An older man seated among the board members, a silver-haired figure named Harold Grayson, who had served on the Whitfield Capital Board for nearly 2 decades, went pale. His fork slipped from his fingers and clattered softly against his plate. He stared at Daniel's retreating figure with an expression somewhere between recognition and dread. And when his wife asked him quietly what was wrong, he did not answer. He simply reached for his phone with trembling hands and began typing a message, his eyes never leaving the man being led toward the door. Nobody else noticed Harold Grayson's reaction. Not at first, because the room was too consumed with its own private theater, murmuring about the strange man and his stranger words, already beginning to reshape the story into something they would repeat at brunches and board meetings for weeks to come. But within minutes, the mood of the evening had begun to shift, subtly at first, like a change in air pressure before a storm nobody could yet see. The hotel's general manager, a meticulous woman named Elaine Marsh, who had overseen 1,000 events without a single visible crisis, appeared at the edge of the ballroom, her face unusually tense. She crossed the room quickly, weaving between tables, and pulled aside one of her senior staff members, speaking in a hushed, urgent tone. Within moments, 3 more members of the hotel's management team had gathered near the entrance, their phones out, their expressions tightening with each passing second. At table 3, a junior board member frowned at his buzzing phone, glanced at the screen, and went very quiet. At table 5, a woman in a navy gown who worked in Whitfield Capital's legal department excused herself abruptly, her heels clicking rapidly across the marble floor as she hurried toward the lobby. The pattern repeated itself across the room in small, quiet ripples, phones lighting up, faces going pale, conversations dying mid-sentence. As guests began receiving messages, none of them wanted to explain aloud. Michael Whitfield, still seated at the head table, felt his own phone vibrate against his chest pocket. He excused himself from a conversation he could no longer follow, stepped back from the table, and checked the screen. The message was from Harold Grayson, sent less than 90 seconds earlier, containing only 6 words. "Do you know who that man is?" Michael frowned, his stomach tightening with a vague unease he could not yet name. He typed back quickly, "No." "Should I?" The reply came almost instantly. "Call me. Now." Michael glanced across the ballroom toward the side exit where Daniel had disappeared only minutes before, then toward Vanessa, who was now laughing with a cluster of admirers, clearly savoring the small drama she had just orchestrated, entirely unaware of the storm gathering just beyond her attention. Something in Michael's chest tightened further. An instinct he had learned to trust over years of high-stakes negotiations, the same instinct that told him when a deal was about to collapse before anyone else in the room had noticed the cracks. He stepped away from the table, phone pressed to his ear, and walked briskly toward the quiet of the hallway outside the ballroom. Meanwhile, near the loading dock behind the hotel, Daniel Carter stood beneath a narrow awning, sheltered from the light autumn rain, waiting patiently while the 2 security guards conferred quietly a short distance away. Neither of them seemed eager to simply release him onto the sidewalk, some unspoken instinct telling them that something about this situation did not add up the way it should have. The taller guard, the one with the graying mustache, approached Daniel with an apologetic expression. "Sir, I'm sorry about all this. Truly. If you'd like, we can call you a car." Daniel offered a small, understanding smile. "That's kind of you. But I think I'll wait here a moment, if you don't mind." The guard hesitated, then nodded, stepping back to rejoin his colleague near the door. Daniel remained where he stood, hands in his coat pockets, watching the rain fall in thin silver lines beneath the streetlights, entirely unbothered by the chaos he had left rippling through the ballroom above. Inside, Michael Whitfield stood in the marble hallway outside the event, phone pressed hard against his ear, listening as Harold Grayson's voice trembled with an urgency he had rarely heard from the older man in all their years working together. 15 years ago, Harold was saying, his words rushed and breathless. "Before this company was worth anything, before you were even running the place, there was a man who saved us." We were 3 weeks from bankruptcy, Michael. 3 weeks. And a private investor came in, bought a controlling stake nobody else wanted, and kept this entire company alive when every bank in the city had already turned us away. Michael's grip on the phone tightened. What does that have to do with tonight? He never showed his face publicly, Harold continued. Used lawyers, shell companies, representatives, everything to stay anonymous. Most of the board never even met him directly. He sold most of his shares years ago and vanished from every record we had. But I saw him tonight, Michael. I saw his face for the first time in 15 years. And I recognized him immediately. He hasn't aged the way you'd expect. Some faces you just don't forget. Who? Michael said quietly, though some part of him had already begun to suspect the answer. A cold certainty settling into his chest, even before Harold spoke the name aloud. Daniel Carter, Harold said. The man your fiancée just had thrown out of his own party. Michael stood frozen in the hallway for a long moment, the noise of the ballroom behind him fading into a distant hum as the full weight of what he had just heard settled over him. He had heard the name Daniel Carter before, buried in old financial records from the company's earliest and most desperate years. A name attached to a single, decisive wire transfer that had kept Whitfield Capital's doors open when every other option had failed. But the name had always felt more like legend than fact, a story passed down through the company's history, rather than a living, breathing person who might one day walk through the front door in a worn-out suit. He ended the call with Harold and immediately dialed the company's general counsel, his voice tight with barely restrained urgency. Within minutes, a small circle of senior staff had gathered quietly near the hotel's business center, phones and laptops open, pulling archived records that few of them had ever needed to access before. Confirmation came faster than Michael expected. Legal documents from 15 years earlier, buried deep in the company's private files, listed Daniel Carter as the sole authorized signer behind the emergency capital injection that had saved Whitfield Capital from total collapse. A retained ownership clause, rarely discussed and mostly forgotten, revealed that Daniel had never fully liquidated his position. A small percentage of shares, modest by today's standards but symbolically enormous, remained quietly in his name to this day. Michael read the documents twice, his hands unsteady, before looking up at his general counsel with an expression of dawning horror. He still owns part of this company, Michael said quietly. Not just that, the counsel replied, scrolling further down the screen. According to this clause, he retains certain voting rights tied to major structural decisions, leadership changes, board composition, even engagements involving senior executives, apparently, given how this clause was worded back then. Michael felt the floor tilt slightly beneath him. Somewhere above them, laughter and music still drifted from the ballroom, oblivious to the quiet reckoning taking shape just beyond its walls. He thought of Vanessa's voice, sharp and confident, cutting across the room only 20 minutes earlier. He thought of the security guards leading Daniel toward the side exit, and the calm, almost sorrowful way the man had accepted his own humiliation without protest. Without another word, Michael turned and moved quickly back toward the ballroom, his pace breaking into something close to a run. He found Vanessa near the center of the room, glowing with the attention of admirers, still recounting the story of the strange man in the old suit with theatrical relish, embellishing details with each retelling. She turned as Michael approached, her smile widening at the sight of him, though it faltered slightly when she registered the expression on his face. "Michael, you would not believe what just happened," she began, reaching for his arm. "Some man just wandered in claiming he had an invitation, if you can imagine. I had him removed immediately, obviously, but honestly the nerve of some people—" "Where is he now?" Michael interrupted, his voice low and urgent. Vanessa blinked, thrown off by his tone. "The security guards took him out through the back, I assume." "Why does it matter?" "He's gone, Michael." "It's handled." Michael did not answer. He turned and moved swiftly toward the side exit, several members of his senior staff falling into step behind him, their expressions tense with the same dawning realization that had gripped Michael only minutes earlier. Vanessa, confused and increasingly irritated, followed at a slower pace, her heels clicking against the marble floor. muttering something about ruining a perfectly good evening over nothing. They found Daniel exactly where he had been standing for the past 20 minutes, sheltered beneath the narrow awning near the loading dock, watching the rain fall with quiet, undisturbed patience. He looked up as the group approached, his expression unreadable, though something in his eyes suggested he had expected this moment all along, as though the entire evening had unfolded exactly according to some private timeline only he could see. Michael stopped a few feet away, his chest tight, his carefully composed executive demeanor cracking for perhaps the first time in years. He opened his mouth, searching for the right words, the professional words, the words that might somehow undo the last half hour, before finally settling on the only ones that felt true. He bowed his head. A slow, deliberate gesture of genuine respect, rarely seen from a man of his position. "Mr. Carter," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology that I don't think words can properly cover." Behind him, the small crowd of staff and curious guests who had followed him outside fell into stunned silence, watching their confident, unshakable chief executive stand humbled before a man they had all dismissed as a stranger less than an hour earlier. Vanessa arrived a moment later, breathless from the pace, and stopped abruptly at the sight of Michael bowing his head before the very man she had just thrown out of the building. Confusion flickered across her face, quickly followed by something sharper, something closer to alarm, though she was not yet certain what exactly she should be afraid of. "Michael," she said carefully, "what is going on?" Michael straightened slowly, turning to face her, his expression a complicated mixture of disbelief and something close to shame. "This is Daniel Carter," he said quietly. 15 years ago, he saved this entire company from bankruptcy. He still holds shares in Whitfield Capital. Real shares, Vanessa. With real voting power over decisions this board makes. The color drained slowly from Vanessa's face as the weight of the words settled over her. Though her pride, ever resilient, fought against the sinking realization taking shape in her chest. She glanced at Daniel, taking in the worn suit and modest watch with new, uncertain eyes, searching for some sign that this was all some elaborate misunderstanding that could still be corrected with the right words. "That's impossible," she said, though her voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "He looks like, no offense, but he looks like someone who works at a hardware store." Daniel did not seem offended by the comment. If anything, something like quiet amusement flickered briefly across his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. "I've been told that before," he said mildly. "It's never bothered me much." Michael turned toward him, his voice earnest, almost pleading. "Please, come back inside. Let us make this right. Whatever you need, whatever this evening owes you, we will provide it." Daniel considered this for a long moment, his eyes moving slowly across the small crowd gathered around him, the staff members, the curious guests who had followed the commotion outside, and finally Vanessa herself, still visibly struggling to reconcile the man before her with the story she had just spent 20 minutes telling to anyone who would listen. "I don't need an apology," Daniel said finally, his voice calm and unhurried. "What I came here for tonight was simply to see, with my own eyes, what kind of company this has become, and what kind of people now stand at its helm." The words landed heavily, and nobody standing beneath that narrow awning needed further explanation to understand exactly what he meant. Daniel agreed, after some gentle persuasion from Michael, to return to the ballroom, though not to rejoin the celebration as a guest of honor, but rather to speak briefly with the board members and senior staff who had known him only as a name buried in old financial records. Word of what had happened spread through the room with startling speed, passing from table to table in urgent whispers, each retelling slightly more dramatic than the last, until by the time Daniel stepped back through the ballroom doors, nearly every guest in the building understood, in broad strokes, exactly who he was. The atmosphere had shifted entirely. The easy laughter and clinking glasses of an hour earlier had given way to something quieter, more watchful, guests straightening in their seats, as Daniel walked slowly across the marble floor toward the small cluster of board members near the head table. Harold Grayson rose immediately, extending a hand that trembled slightly with emotion. "Daniel," he said, his voice thick. "It's been a very long time." "It has," Daniel agreed, shaking his hand warmly. "You look well, Harold. I can't believe you're actually here," Harold continued, shaking his head in wonder. "After all these years of anonymous filings and lawyers handling everything, I never imagined I'd see your face again." Daniel offered a small, tired smile. "I try to stay out of rooms like this one, generally. But I had a reason to come tonight." Around them, the other board members and senior executives had gone quiet, watching the exchange with a mixture of awe and lingering disbelief. Someone near the back of the crowd, unable to help himself, finally asked the question hanging over the entire room. "Why did you dress like that?" the man asked, immediately regretting the bluntness of the question the moment it left his mouth. "I mean, no disrespect intended. It's just, given everything you've done for this company." One might expect, Daniel did not seem bothered by the question. He had clearly been asked some version of it before, in one form or another. Across many years of quiet, deliberate living, he glanced down briefly at his worn suit sleeve before answering. "I've found," he said slowly, "that expensive clothing tends to change how people treat you. But it rarely changes who you actually are underneath it. I'd rather know how someone treats a man in an old suit than how they treat a man in a new one. It tells you far more about their character than any conversation ever could." The words settled over the room like a quiet verdict, and more than a few guests, recalling their own laughter from earlier in the evening, found themselves suddenly very interested in the contents of their wine glasses. Vanessa stood at the edge of the gathering, increasingly aware of the shifting eyes around her. Guests who had laughed alongside her only an hour earlier, now avoiding her gaze entirely, whispering behind, raised hands in a way that felt uncomfortably familiar, though this time, she was not the one delivering the humiliation. She forced a tight smile onto her face and stepped forward, attempting to salvage what she could of the evening. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice carefully measured, "I do apologize for any confusion earlier. I had no idea who you were, of course, and I'm sure you understand how these situations can be misread." Daniel turned to look at her, his expression neither hostile nor forgiving, simply observant, the way one might study an unfamiliar painting, searching for meaning in the brushstrokes. "The confusion," he said evenly, "wasn't about who I was. It was about how you believed people should be treated based on appearances alone. That confusion existed before I ever walked through that door tonight, and I suspect it will exist long after I leave." Vanessa's smile faltered, color rising in her cheeks. Around her, the silence deepened, guests leaning subtly closer to catch every word of the exchange. The earlier video recordings from her outburst already beginning to circulate quietly among phones throughout the room, the footage traveling faster than she could possibly contain. "That's not fair," she said, her voice tightening. "You can't judge my entire character based on one misunderstanding." "I'm not judging your character based on one misunderstanding," Daniel replied calmly. "I'm judging it based on what you chose to say, in front of hundreds of people, when you believed there would be no consequences for saying it." The words hit their mark with quiet precision. And for the first time all evening, Vanessa found herself entirely without a response. Standing exposed beneath the weight of her own earlier confidence, now curdling slowly into something closer to dread. Michael stepped closer, placing a hand gently on Daniel's shoulder, his expression grave. "Mr. Carter, I want you to know that whatever happened tonight does not reflect the values of this company, or the values I intend to lead it with going forward." Daniel studied him for a long moment, before nodding slowly. "We'll see," he said simply. "Actions tend to speak louder than intentions, in my experience." The following morning, the fallout began in earnest. Clips of Vanessa's outburst, recorded discreetly by several guests the night before, had already begun circulating across financial news outlets and business commentary channels. Framed not as gossip, but as a genuine question about the culture taking root inside one of the city's most closely watched companies. Analysts speculated openly about what Daniel Carter's unexpected reappearance might mean for Whitfield Capital's leadership, dredging up old records of his original investment and the quiet influence he still held over major structural decisions. Michael arrived at the office before dawn, having barely slept. and found an emergency board meeting already assembling in the main conference room. The mood tense and unusually somber. Harold Grayson sat at the head of the table, papers spread before him, his expression grim as he waited for the others to settle. "We need to discuss last night," Harold began, once the room had quieted. "Not just the embarrassment of it, though that alone is significant. We need to discuss what it revealed." One of the younger board members, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Nguyen, who had joined the company only 2 years earlier, leaned forward. "With respect, Harold, are we seriously going to let one uncomfortable dinner scene dictate company decisions? People say foolish things under pressure." "It happens. This wasn't pressure," Harold replied evenly. "This was public cruelty. Directed at a man who, whether she knew it or not, holds real influence over this company's future. And more importantly, it revealed something about the judgment of the woman who would soon be standing beside our chief executive at every major function this company holds." Michael sat quietly at the far end of the table, listening to the debate unfold around him. His jaw tight, his thoughts elsewhere, he kept returning, again and again, to the calm, unshaken expression on Daniel's face as Vanessa's words had cut across the ballroom, the complete absence of anger or humiliation in his response. It was not weakness, Michael realized slowly. It was something closer to certainty, the quiet confidence of a man who had long ago stopped needing anyone else's approval to know his own worth. Later that afternoon, Michael requested a private meeting with Daniel, arranged through Harold's careful mediation, and found himself sitting across a small, unremarkable coffee shop table from the man who had once quietly saved his entire company from ruin. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," Michael began, wrapping both hands around a cup of coffee he had barely touched. "About actions speaking louder than intentions." Daniel nodded slowly, waiting for him to continue. "I've built my entire career around this company," Michael said. "I've made hard decisions, difficult ones. Decisions that cost people their jobs and cost me sleep some nights. But last night was different. Last night, I watched someone I care about treat another human being as though he were beneath basic decency. And I said nothing. I let it happen for nearly 10 minutes before I even understood who you were." "Would it have mattered?" Daniel asked quietly. "If I had simply been who I appeared to be, a man in an old suit, with nothing behind his name." Michael opened his mouth, then closed it again, the honest answer catching uncomfortably in his throat. He had not intervened when he believed Daniel was simply an uninvited stranger. He had only moved once the stakes became clear. Once his own company's future hung in the balance. "No," Michael admitted finally, quietly. "It wouldn't have mattered. And that's the part that's been eating at me all day." Daniel studied him for a long moment, something almost gentle in his expression now. The sharp edge from the night before softened into something closer to patience. "That honesty," he said, "is worth more to me than any apology you could offer. Most men in your position would have found a way to justify their silence. You didn't." "So what happens now?" Michael asked. "With the company, with the shares, with everything." Daniel set down his own cup, folding his hands together on the table. "I built this company's foundation once, a long time ago, when it was drowning, and nobody else believed it was worth saving. I've watched quietly from a distance ever since, through representatives, through paperwork, never once needing to step into a room like the one you filled last night. But I came last night because I'd heard things, rumors about the culture forming inside this company, about the kind of people rising toward its top. I wanted to see the truth with my own eyes, rather than trust second-hand reports." "And what did you see?" Michael asked, bracing himself for the answer. "I saw a company that has forgotten where it came from," Daniel said simply. "And I saw a man who still has time to remember." Over the following days, Michael found himself facing the most difficult decision of his professional life. One that had nothing to do with mergers, valuations, or quarterly earnings, and everything to do with the kind of man he intended to become. Daniel had made his position clear without ever issuing an ultimatum. A rare kind of restraint that somehow made the weight of the decision heavier rather than lighter. He would either continue his quiet involvement in the company or withdraw entirely, taking his remaining shares and influence with him. The choice, he insisted, belonged entirely to Michael and the leadership he intended to build around him. But beneath that choice lay a second, more personal one, unspoken yet unmistakable. Vanessa had spent the days since the engagement dinner attempting damage control, meeting with public relations consultants, drafting careful statements designed to soften the footage circulating online, framing her outburst as an unfortunate misunderstanding rather than what it truly had been. She called Michael repeatedly, her voice oscillating between wounded confusion and barely restrained frustration, unable to understand why the incident refused to simply fade away the way her previous missteps always had. "You're letting one bad moment define our entire relationship," she said during one particularly tense phone call, her voice tight with disbelief. "People are going to move on from this, Michael. They always do." "That's exactly the problem," Michael replied quietly. "You're treating it like a public relations issue." "I'm starting to realize it was never that. It was a window into how you see people who can't offer you anything in return." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long and heavy before Vanessa spoke again, her voice smaller now, stripped of its usual polish. "So what are you saying?" Michael closed his eyes, steadying himself before answering, aware that whatever he said next would reshape the rest of his life in ways he could not yet fully measure. "I'm saying I need time to think about what kind of company I want to lead, and what kind of person I want standing beside me while I lead it." He did not offer her false comfort, nor did he end things abruptly in that single conversation, but something between them had already begun to fracture beyond repair. A crack that had opened the moment Vanessa's laughter cut across the ballroom, widening steadily with every passing day that followed. A week after the engagement dinner, Michael called another board meeting. This time, with a clear resolution in mind, rather than a debate to be settled. He stood at the head of the conference table, Harold Grayson seated to his right, and addressed the room with a steadiness that surprised even himself. "I've spent the last several days thinking about what happened at the Ellsworth Grand," Michael began, "and about what it revealed, not just about one person's behavior, but about the culture we've allowed to take root inside this company. We built our success on the willingness of one man to take a chance on us when nobody else would. And somewhere along the way, we forgot that the values which built this company matter just as much as the profits it generates." He paused, glancing briefly toward the door, where Daniel stood quietly at the back of the room, having accepted Michael's invitation to attend. Though he had insisted on remaining out of the spotlight, watching rather than participating. "Effective immediately," Michael continued, "I'm proposing a full leadership review, starting with our executive engagement policies and extending through every level of senior management. Anyone whose conduct reflects the same values displayed at that dinner will be asked to step down from their positions within this company." A tense murmur moved through the room, several board members exchanging uneasy glances, though none moved to object outright. Patricia Nguyen, who had initially dismissed the incident as overblown, now nodded slowly, her earlier skepticism replaced by quiet reconsideration. "And my engagement to Vanessa Cole," Michael added, his voice steady despite the visible effort it cost him, "is officially called off, effective as of this morning." The room fell silent at this final announcement, the weight of it settling over the assembled board members with the gravity of a decision that would ripple far beyond the walls of that conference room. Harold Grayson reached over and placed a steady hand on Michael's shoulder. A small gesture of quiet approval that meant more to Michael in that moment than any applause the room might have offered. Near the back, Daniel watched the exchange with an unreadable expression, though something in the set of his shoulders suggested a long-held tension had finally begun to ease. In the weeks that followed, Whitfield Capital underwent changes that reached far beyond the departure of a single fiancée. Michael implemented a company-wide review of leadership conduct, quietly removing several senior executives whose behavior, once examined closely, revealed patterns disturbingly similar to the arrogance displayed at that engagement dinner. He did not act out of vengeance or public pressure alone, but out of a genuine, hard-won understanding that the culture at the top of a company inevitably shapes the culture throughout every level beneath it. Daniel, true to his word, did not seek revenge against anyone involved in that evening's humiliation, not even Vanessa herself, whose reputation within the city's business circles suffered regardless, the footage of her cruelty circulating far longer and far wider than any public relations effort could contain. He offered no public statements, gave no interviews, sought no credit for the changes unfolding inside the company he had once quietly saved. Instead, he worked alongside Michael and Harold in careful, unhurried consultations, helping to rebuild not the company's finances, which had never truly been in danger, but its sense of purpose, the foundation of values it had drifted away from over years of rapid, unchecked growth. Employees who had feared for their jobs during the leadership review found, to their quiet relief, that Daniel's influence protected rather than threatened them. He insisted, firmly and repeatedly, that the restructuring focus solely on those in positions of power who had allowed arrogance and cruelty to define their leadership style, never on the hard-working staff who had simply been trying to survive within a broken culture they had not created. A company isn't measured by its executives alone, Daniel told Michael during one of their quiet meetings, months into the process. It's measured by how it treats the people with the least power to defend themselves. Everything else is just decoration. Michael absorbed the words carefully, writing them down in a small notebook he had begun keeping, a habit he had never needed before, filled increasingly with lessons he suspected he would spend the rest of his career trying to fully understand. Vanessa Cole's fall from the city's social and business circles was neither dramatic nor immediate, but it was thorough, the kind of quiet unraveling that comes not from a single catastrophic event, but from the slow accumulation of consequences nobody bothers to soften on your behalf. Invitations that once arrived in steady streams began to thin. Business partnerships she had once taken for granted quietly distanced themselves, citing vague concerns about brand alignment and public perception. The very circles that had laughed alongside her that autumn evening now regarded her with the same wariness once reserved for the man she had humiliated. She attempted, for a time, to rebuild her image through calculated public appearances and carefully worded interviews, framing herself as a woman who had learned from a painful mistake, but the effort rang hollow to those who had watched the footage closely, who had heard the casual cruelty in her voice as she mocked a man's shoes, his suit, his very right to occupy space in a room he had been formally invited into. Redemption, she discovered slowly and painfully, could not simply be purchased or performed. It had to be earned, quietly and consistently, over far longer than any public relations campaign allowed for. Daniel never once commented publicly on her downfall, nor did he take any satisfaction in it when Harold mentioned it to him in passing. She made her own bed, Daniel said simply. I don't need to make it any harder for her to lie in it. Some lessons only stick when a person is left alone to learn them. A full year passed, and the transformation inside Whitfield Capital proved far more lasting than anyone, even Michael himself, had initially dared to hope. The company's culture, once quietly rotting beneath its polished surface, had shifted into something steadier, more grounded, built increasingly around the values Daniel had spoken of so plainly during their early conversations. Employee turnover dropped significantly. Internal surveys began reflecting genuine improvements in morale and trust throughout every level of the organization. Michael himself had changed in ways both visible and subtle. He listened more than he spoke during meetings now, a habit that had taken considerable effort to cultivate. After years of assuming his position alone entitled him to the loudest voice in any room. He made a point of learning the names of employees far below his own pay grade, stopping to ask about their families, their concerns, their ideas for improving the company from the ground up, rather than simply from the top down. The arrogance that had once quietly shaped his leadership style had not vanished entirely, but it had been tempered, softened into something closer to genuine humility. Daniel, true to the life he had built for himself over the past 15 years, remained largely out of the public eye, refusing every award, every honorary title, every opportunity Michael and the board offered him to be publicly celebrated for the role he had quietly played in the company's turnaround. He continued to wear the same modest suits, the same inexpensive watch, entirely unconcerned with the perception others might form based on his appearance. When Whitfield Capital planned its annual celebration marking the company's founding, Michael insisted, against Daniel's initial reluctance, that he attend as an honored guest. And this time, there would be no confusion about where he belonged in the room. The celebration was held, not at the Ellsworth Grand, but at a smaller, more understated venue Michael had chosen specifically, a converted warehouse space filled with simple string lights and long communal tables rather than towering chandeliers and rigid seating charts designed to broadcast hierarchy. It was, in its quiet way, a deliberate departure from everything the engagement dinner had represented the year before, a symbol of the company's slow, steady transformation made visible in the very architecture of the room. Daniel arrived, dressed exactly as he always did, in a suit that had grown even more familiar to the company's employees over the past year, no longer a source of confusion or judgment, but simply a recognizable part of who he was. Employees greeted him warmly as he moved through the room, many of them approaching to thank him personally for changes they credited, correctly or not, entirely to his quiet influence. Near the end of the evening, Michael stepped up to a small platform at the center of the room and asked for everyone's attention, the low hum of conversation gradually fading into an attentive hush. He spoke briefly about the company's history, about the difficult year that had passed, about lessons learned in ways none of them could have anticipated 12 months earlier. Then, turning toward the crowd, he extended an invitation that had clearly been planned for some time. "There's someone here tonight," Michael said, "who taught this company, and taught me personally, more about leadership and character than any business school ever could. I'd like to ask him to say a few words, if he's willing." A ripple of applause spread through the room as heads turned toward Daniel, who stood quietly near the back, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden attention but unwilling to refuse Michael's request outright. He made his way slowly to the small platform, the same unhurried patience marking every step, and stood for a moment in silence, gathering his thoughts before finally speaking. "I've never been comfortable with attention," Daniel began, his voice carrying easily through the quiet room. "I've spent most of my life avoiding rooms exactly like this one, but I came tonight because I've watched something genuinely rare happen inside this company over the past year. Something worth acknowledging out loud, even if it makes an old man slightly uncomfortable to do so." Soft laughter moved through the crowd, easing some of the tension in the room. "A little over a year ago," Daniel continued, "I walked into a room very much like this one, wearing exactly what I'm wearing tonight. And I was told, quite directly, that I didn't belong there, that my clothes, my watch, my shoes, somehow disqualified me from being treated with basic respect." The room grew quieter still, many of the employees present having heard some version of the story, though few had heard it directly from Daniel himself. "I could have argued that night," he said. "I could have revealed who I was immediately, and I imagine the entire situation would have resolved itself within seconds. But I wanted to see, honestly, and without interference, exactly what kind of values had taken root inside this company. And what I saw troubled me deeply." He paused, his eyes moving slowly across the room, resting briefly on Michael, before continuing. "But what I've watched happen since that night has restored something in me I hadn't realized I'd lost faith in. I've watched a company choose humility over arrogance, character over appearance, decency over convenience, even when those choices were difficult and costly. That transformation didn't happen because of me. It happened because enough people inside this company decided it mattered." He allowed the words to settle over the room before delivering his final thought, the one that would be repeated in quiet conversations, in employee newsletters, and eventually in business articles discussing the company's remarkable turnaround for years to come. "A suit can make you look wealthy," Daniel said, his voice calm and unhurried. "But only your character can make people genuinely respect you. Never confuse the two, no matter how successful you become." The room rose to its feet in applause that lasted far longer than Daniel seemed comfortable with, though he accepted it graciously, nodding quietly before stepping down from the platform and disappearing once more into the crowd, exactly the way he preferred it. Later that night, After the celebration had wound down and most of the guests had drifted toward the exits, Daniel stepped outside into a light autumn rain that felt almost identical to the one that had greeted him a year earlier, standing beneath a hotel awning as a stranger with an old suit and an uncertain welcome. This time, there were no security guards waiting to escort him away. He walked alone down the quiet street, collar turned up against the chill, entirely unaccompanied by any entourage or fanfare. Exactly as he had always preferred to move through the world. Behind him, the warehouse windows glowed warmly against the darkening evening, filled with the quiet laughter and conversation of people who had, in their own imperfect way, learned something lasting about the difference between appearance and character. Michael watched him go from the doorway, understanding now, in a way he hadn't fully grasped a year earlier, exactly what kind of man had walked into his engagement dinner and, without ever raising his voice, changed the entire direction of his company and his life. Daniel Carter disappeared around the corner of the street, his footsteps fading into the soft patter of rain against the pavement, leaving behind him not wealth flaunted or power displayed, but something far rarer and far more difficult to earn, a legacy built entirely on the simple, unshakable truth that the measure of a person was never found in what covered their body, but always, without exception, in what lived quietly inside it.